On a Tuesday morning in late March of 2019, the Neosho National Fish Hatchery in Neosho, Missouri, posted a notice that most people in the aquaculture business would have scrolled past without a second thought. 11,000 paddlefish fry, surplus to their propagation program, were available for transfer to qualified facilities. The hatchery had done its job, collected eggs, fertilized them, hatched them, raised them through their most vulnerable stage, and now the program had more fish than it had tanks for. The notice would expire in 30 days. After that, the fish would be disposed of. Nobody called. Nobody called for 3 weeks. Let me tell you about Willa Salazar because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from almost every character this channel has ever told you about. She was 23 years old in the spring of 2019. She had grown up in Platte County, Nebraska, on her family's 800-acre row crop operation. Corn on the bottom ground, soybeans on the higher fields, winter wheat when the prices made sense. Her father, Ernesto Salazar, had farmed the same ground his father had broken in the 1960s, and he was good at it. Methodical, careful, unafraid of hard work. The kind of farmer who kept his equipment in the same shed his father had built, who planted the same varieties his neighbors planted because those varieties had earned their place. He had never lost a crop to a bad decision. He had never made a decision that wasn't backed by 30 years of watching the same ground behave the same way. Willa had grown up watching him. She had also grown up watching the margin statements, and by the time she was 17, she understood something her father hadn't fully articulated yet. The operation was profitable, but it was not resilient. One bad corn year, one price crash, one drought that hit it the wrong week in July. The math was close enough that any one of those things, arriving alone, could be managed. 2 of them arriving together could not. She went to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln on a partial scholarship and studied agricultural science with a concentration in aquaculture systems, which was not a thing any of her father's neighbors had studied, and was not a thing her father entirely understood. She spent her junior year working in the lab of a professor named Dr. Anita Koenig, who had spent 15 years studying polyculture integration in freshwater systems, the practice of raising fish in combination with crops, using the fish waste to fertilize the fields, and the field runoff to feed the fish. It was not a new idea. It was, in fact, an ancient idea. But Dr. Koenig's work was focused on making it work in the specific conditions of the Central Great Plains, where water was scarce and land was expensive, and farmers were skeptical of anything that required them to learn a new language. Willa read everything Dr. Koenig had written. She also read the studies coming out of Missouri and Arkansas and Kentucky, where farmers had been experimenting with paddlefish aquaculture for a decade. Paddlefish were native to the Missouri River system. They were filter feeders. They ate plankton, not pellets, which meant they didn't require the expensive feed inputs that made most aquaculture operations economically marginal. They grew fast. They lived long, and they produced something that almost no American farmer was producing in 2019, caviar. American paddlefish roe, properly processed, was selling on the international market for between $40 and $60 per ounce. The fish themselves, processed for meat, were bringing $3 to $4 per pound at specialty processors. A single mature female paddlefish, harvested at the right time, could yield 8 to 12 pounds of roe. She wrote her senior thesis on the economic case for paddlefish aquaculture integration in Nebraska row crop operations. Dr. Koenig read the first draft and told her it was the most thorough student analysis she had seen in a decade. She also told Willa that the analysis was correct, but that being correct was not the same as being believed, and that she should be prepared for the second part to take longer than the first. Willa graduated in May of 2018. She came home to Platte County. She put her thesis in a folder, and she spent 6 months working the fields alongside her father before she said a word about any of it. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened in the Salazar kitchen in November of 2018, because it is the kind of conversation that looks small from the outside and turns out to be enormous. It was a Sunday evening after the last of the soybeans were in. Ernesto was at the table with a cup of coffee and the farm's year-end spreadsheet printed on 3 sheets of paper. Willa's mother, Carmen, was at the counter. The radio was on low. Willa sat down across from her father and put the folder on the table. She didn't open it right away. She said, "Dad, I want to talk to you about something that's going to sound strange." Ernesto looked at the folder and then at her. He said, "Okay." She said, "I want to put fish ponds on the back 40. He looked at the folder again. He said, "Fish," she said. "Paddlefish for Caviar." The kitchen went quiet. Carmen stopped what she was doing at the counter. Ernesto set down his coffee cup and did not pick it up again for a long time. She opened the folder. Let me tell you about the science, because it is the reason this story ends the way it does, and because Willa had spent 2 years making sure she understood it well enough to explain it to a man who had never thought about fish as a crop. Paddlefish, Polyodon spathula, are one of the oldest vertebrate species in North America. They have been in the Missouri River system for something close to 300 million years, which means they were here before the Rocky Mountains were here. They are filter feeders, which is the critical fact. They swim with their mouths open, filtering zooplankton and phytoplankton directly from the water column. They do not compete with other fish for food in the way that most farmed species do. They do not require manufactured feed. In a properly managed pond with adequate sunlight and a modest fertilization program to promote plankton growth, they will grow 2 to 3 pounds per year on essentially nothing you have to buy. The studies Willa cited were specific. A University of Missouri Extension trial from 2014 had tracked paddlefish pond yields across 12 farms over 4 years. Average net revenue per surface acre of pond, after all inputs including pond construction amortized over 20 years, was running between $800 and $1,200 per acre per year by year 3. The corn ground those ponds replaced was netting, in the same period, between $180 and $340 per acre depending on price and yield. The comparison was not close. The roe market was the reason. A single female paddlefish reaching harvest maturity, typically 7 to 10 years, though some producers were seeing harvestable fish in 5, could yield roe worth $400 to $700 at wholesale prices. Per fish. 1 fish. The integration piece was what made it work for a row crop operation. The pond effluent, the water enriched by fish waste, could be used to irrigate the adjacent fields, reducing fertilizer inputs on those acres by an amount that the Missouri trial had measured at between 30 and 45%. The fields fed the pond fed the fields. It was not a side business. It was a second system running on the same land. Ernesto listened to all of it. He looked at the papers. He looked at the yield tables and the revenue comparisons and the photographs of the Missouri operation Willa had visited the previous summer. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long before the first fish are ready?" She said, 7 years, maybe 5 if conditions are good. He said, "That's a long time to find out if you're wrong." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you need the back 40. She said, "To start." He looked at Carmen. Carmen looked at him. Then she looked at Willa and said quietly, "She's right, you know. Read the numbers again." Ernesto picked up his coffee cup. He said, "I need to think about it." He took the folder and he read it again that night, alone, after Willa had gone to bed. He said yes in December, not enthusiastically, carefully. He said she could have the back 40 acres of lower ground that had always been the hardest acres on the farm to manage, wet in spring, compacted by years of row crop traffic, the acres that never hit their yield potential. He said she could dig 2 ponds. He said she was responsible for the cost of construction and the cost of stocking and the cost of any equipment she needed, and that he would not be reducing the farm's operating budget to fund it. He said, "If it works, it works. If it doesn't, we put the ground back in beans." She said, "Fair enough." She shook his hand across the kitchen table. She called the University of Nebraska Extension office the following week. She called Dr. Koenig. She started drawing pond designs on graph paper at the kitchen table at night. She was 22 years old, and she was going to raise paddlefish for Caviar in Platte County, Nebraska, and she was the only person within 100 miles who thought that was a reasonable thing to do. Let me tell you about Ned Crowley, because you need to understand him before you can understand what he said and why it mattered. Ned Crowley had been the manager of the Platte County Farm Bureau Co-op for 22 years. He was 61 years old, a large man with a deliberate way of speaking that people in the county had learned to interpret as authority. He had grown up farming, had moved into the co-op side after a bad stretch in the mid-90s, and had spent 2 decades as the person farmers came to when they needed inputs, advice, financing referrals, or just someone to tell them they were doing it right. He held court at the co-op counter most mornings between 7 and 9, and what he said at that counter had a way of becoming what people believed. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had watched a lot of farmers try things that didn't work, and he had developed a reflex over 22 years of protecting people from their own enthusiasm. The problem with that reflex is that it does not distinguish between bad ideas and unfamiliar ones. Willa had been in the co-op in February of 2019, picking up soil amendment supplies when Crowley asked her how the pond project was coming along. Word traveled fast in Platte County. She told him she had the permits, had contracted with an excavation company, and was looking at spring stocking once the ponds were finished. He asked what she was stocking. She said paddlefish. He asked what for. She said caviar and meat. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Ned Crowley started laughing. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has seen a lot and believes that what he has seen constitutes the full range of what is possible. It was the laugh of someone who is not trying to be cruel, but who cannot imagine that the person in front of him might know something he doesn't. He said, "Caviar in Nebraska." She said, "Yes." He said, "Honey, paddlefish take 7 years to mature. You're going to be 30 years old before you find out if this works." She said, 29. He said, "And you're tying up 40 acres of ground to do it." She said, "The 40 acres that's been underperforming for 15 years. He waved his hand. "Those are still corn acres. "You know what corn's going to do this year?" she said. "Same thing it did last year." He said, "That's right. You know what paddlefish are going to do?" She said, "Grow." He laughed again, shorter this time, and turned back to his counter. "Good luck to you," he said. It was the kind of thing you say when you mean the opposite. "Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you watched someone laugh at an idea and thought about what the laugh was actually protecting?" Ned Crowley had spent 22 years being the person people listened to. He had built his authority on knowing what worked in Platte County, and what worked in Platte County was corn and soybeans and winter wheat, same as it had always been. Willa's ponds were not a threat to him personally, but they were a threat to the framework he had spent a career maintaining. The idea that the right answers were already known, that the ground had already told everyone what it wanted to grow, and that a 22-year-old woman with a folder full of Missouri data was not the person who was going to tell Platte County something it didn't already know. She drove home. She told her father what Crowley had said. Ernesto was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Crowley's been wrong before." It was the most supportive thing he said to her for the next 18 months. The excavation company broke ground on the ponds in April of 2019. 2 ponds, each approximately 12 surface acres, fed by a gravity flow system from the farm's existing irrigation infrastructure. The construction cost $47,000, which Willa paid from her savings, a small loan from Carmen's parents, and a USDA beginning farmer microloan she had applied for in January. The ponds filled with spring rain and groundwater through May. By June, they were holding water, and she had begun the fertilization program, a careful, measured application of organic nitrogen to promote the plankton bloom that the paddlefish would need when they arrived. That is when she saw the hatchery notice. 11,000 paddlefish fry from the Neosho National Fish Hatchery, available for transfer, expiring in 30 days. The fry were approximately 3 weeks old, small enough to transport, old enough to survive the stress of transfer if handled correctly. The hatchery was asking for nothing except proof of a qualified facility and a commitment to proper husbandry. They were going to dispose of the fish. She called the hatchery on a Wednesday morning. She spoke with a fisheries biologist named Dr. Marcus Webb, who asked her about her pond specifications, her water quality monitoring plan, her aeration system, and her experience with paddlefish. She answered every question. He asked if she had ever raised paddlefish before. She said no, but she'd spent 6 months corresponding with producers in Missouri and Arkansas, had visited 2 operations, and had her pond design reviewed by Dr. Koenig at the University of Nebraska. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've done your homework." She said, "Yes." He said he would process her application. The fish arrived on a Thursday in late June of 2019 in oxygenated transport bags in the back of a hatchery truck. 11,000 paddlefish fry, each one roughly the size of a paperclip, transferred into the acclimation tanks Willa had set up in the barn. She spent 14 hours that day monitoring water temperature, dissolved oxygen, and pH, adjusting conditions in increments small enough not to shock fish that had never been outside a hatchery. By Friday morning, she had released them into the ponds. She stood at the edge of the water for a long time after the last bag was empty. Her father came out and stood beside her. He looked at the water, which showed no sign of 11,000 fish because 11,000 fish the size of paper clips are invisible in 24 acres of pond. He said, "You can't even see them." She said, "No." He said, "How do you know they're alive?" She said, "I don't, not for certain. I'll know more in a week." He nodded. He went back to the barn. "Let me tell you about the first year, because it was the year that tested whether Willa's knowledge was the kind that worked in a textbook or the kind that worked in the ground." The summer of 2019 was hot and dry across Platte County, which was not unusual, but it was the kind of heat that pushed pond water temperatures into ranges that stressed juvenile paddlefish. Willa had read about thermal stratification and impoundments. The way a pond in summer develops distinct temperature layers, with warm water at the surface and cooler water below, and the way that stratification can create oxygen-depleted zones near the bottom where fish cannot survive. She had installed aeration equipment based on Dr. Koenig's recommendations. In July, when the surface temperature in the East Pond climbed to 89 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 consecutive days, she ran the aerators continuously, day and night, cycling the water column to prevent stratification. Her electric bill for July was $340. She paid it without complaint. She lost approximately 800 fish that summer, a mortality rate of about 7%, which was within the range the Missouri studies had predicted for first-year pond culture. She documented every death she found, recorded the conditions at time of death, and adjusted her management protocol accordingly. By September, the survivors were averaging 8 inches in length. By October, when she drained a section of the East Pond for the first time to assess the population, she counted fish that were healthy, active, and growing faster than the conservative estimates in her thesis. She wrote all of it down. The neighbors drove past on the county road. Some of them slowed down to look at the ponds. A few stopped and asked Ernesto what his daughter was doing. He told them she was raising fish. They asked what kind. He said paddlefish. They nodded in the way that people nod when they don't want to say what they're thinking. At the co-op that fall, Ned Crowley told someone, Willa heard about it later from her cousin, that the Salazar girls' fish project was an interesting experiment, and that he hoped she knew what she was getting into. His smile, by all accounts, was still there when he said it, but it had gotten smaller. Year 2 was the year Willa began to understand the difference between knowing something and owning it. The fish had survived their first winter. Paddlefish are cold-tolerant, and the ponds had not frozen solid, which she had planned for by maintaining adequate depth. In the spring of 2020, she stocked an additional 4,000 fingerlings from a private hatchery in Missouri, using the second pond to begin a staggered age class system that would allow her to harvest fish in rotation rather than all at once. She also began the soil application program, pumping pond effluent onto the adjacent soybean acres at rates calculated to replace a portion of the commercial nitrogen she would otherwise have purchased. The soybean yield on those acres in 2020 was 54 bushels per acre. The county average was 48. She'd spent $0 on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer on those specific acres. She wrote that down, too. She presented the Year 2 data at a Nebraska Extension Field Day in October of 2020. 31 farmers attended. She stood at a folding table with a laptop and a printed handout and walked through her pond design, her stocking rates, her mortality data, her feed cost data, which was essentially zero because paddlefish don't eat feed, and her preliminary soybean yield results from the integrated acres. She was 24 years old. She was wearing a Carhartt jacket and a seed cap, and she had grease on her left hand from fixing the aerator pump that morning, and she had not had time to clean it off. 3 farmers asked serious questions. Two of them came out to the farm the following week to look at the ponds. Ned Crowley was not at the field day, but someone told him about it, and he told someone else that the yield differential on the soybeans was probably just that ground having a good year, and that it was too early to draw conclusions. His voice, by that account, had lost some of its certainty. Let me tell you about the spring of 2021, because that is when the story began to move faster than anyone expected. Willa had been corresponding for 2 years with a specialty food broker in Chicago named Paul Hennessy, who represented several high-end restaurants and specialty retailers in the Midwest and on the East Coast. Hennessy dealt in American-produced artisan food products, small-batch cheeses, heritage breed meats, specialty grains, and he had been watching the American Paddlefish caviar market with interest, since a Kentucky producer he represented had sold out of their entire roe inventory in 2019 at $52 per ounce. He had found Willa through Dr. Koenig's network. They had exchanged emails. He had asked questions she answered thoroughly. In March of 2021, he drove from Chicago to Platte County, Nebraska, to see the operation. He spent 4 hours at the farm. He walked the ponds with Willa. He looked at her records, 2 years of water quality data, growth rate measurements, mortality logs, feed cost records, soil application logs, soybean yield comparisons. He asked about her harvest timeline. She told him the first fish would be ready for roe harvest in 2024 at the earliest, possibly 2026 for the larger females. He asked about the meat market in the interim. She told him she had already been in contact with a specialty processor in Kansas City, who was buying paddlefish meat from Missouri producers at $3.75 per pound, and who had expressed interest in a Nebraska source. Hennessy drove back to Chicago and called her the following week. He said he wanted to be her broker when the RO was ready. He said he could place it at $48 per ounce to start, with the expectation of moving toward $55 to $60 as her production volume allowed for consistent supply. He said he had 3 buyers in Chicago and 2 in New York who were specifically looking for domestic paddlefish roe from traceable, well-documented operations, and that her records were better than any producer he had seen outside of a commercial facility. She called her father into the kitchen. She put the phone on the table. She said, "A broker in Chicago wants to buy the caviar." Ernesto looked at the phone. He said, "How much?" She told him. He sat down. "Let me tell you about what happened in the summer of 2022, because it is the year that answered every question Ned Crowley had ever asked, and it answered them in a way that no one in Platte County was prepared for. The summer of 2022 was the worst growing season in Platte County in 19 years. The drought that had been building across the Central Plains since the previous fall arrived in June as something close to a catastrophe. Rainfall from May through August was 4.2 inches. The county average for that period was 14.8 inches. Corn that had looked promising in May was showing stress by the 3rd week of June and was visibly failing by the 4th of July. The irrigation systems ran constantly, but the aquifer was down, and the wells were pulling slower than the fields needed. By the end of July, the county extension office was estimating yield losses of 35 to 50% on non-irrigated ground. Irrigated fields were doing better, but the cost of the water was eating the margin. The soybean situation was worse in some ways because soybeans are less tolerant of heat stress during flowering than corn, and July of 2022 had 11 days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Pods that had set in June aborted in July. Farmers who had planted soybeans on their best ground were harvesting 28 to 35 bushels per acre on fields that had averaged 50 the year before. Willa's row crop acres, the ground not in ponds, had the same problems everyone else had. She lost yield. She was not immune to drought, but she had two things no one else in her part of the county had. She had 24 acres of ponds that did not need rain to produce, and she had the effluent irrigation system that had been running pond water onto the adjacent acres since 2020. The acres adjacent to the ponds, about 60 acres of soybeans, had been receiving supplemental irrigation from the pond system all summer. Water that was also carrying the dissolved organic nutrients from 3 years of fish waste. Those 60 acres averaged 41 bushels per acre in 2022. The county average was 31. The difference was not a rounding error. It was 10 bushels per acre across 60 acres, in the worst drought year in 2 decades. The ponds themselves were unaffected by the drought in any meaningful way. The water level dropped, but the paddlefish don't care about rain. They care about dissolved oxygen and water temperature and plankton density, all of which Willa managed with her aerators and her fertilization program. The fish grew through the drought the same way they would have grown through a wet year, because they were not dependent on the sky. She ran the numbers in August, while her neighbors were still trying to figure out how bad the damage was. Her pond acres, 40 acres of capital investment, had produced 0 crop loss. Her integrated soybean acres had outperformed the county by 10 bushels per acre. Her total farm revenue for 2022, even with the row crop losses on the non-integrated ground, was within 8% of her best year. Her neighbors, on comparable ground, were looking at revenue losses of 30 to 45%. She did not make an announcement. She did not go to the co-op and tell Ned Crowley he had been wrong. She went back to her records and wrote it all down. But Platte County is a small place. 30 farms, 50 farms, 100 farms. People know what their neighbors are doing and what their neighbors are getting. By September, people were stopping at the end of the Salazar driveway and looking at the ponds, and the questions they were asking Ernesto were different from the questions they had asked before. They were not asking what his daughter was doing. They were asking how she had done it. Ernesto came in from the field one evening in late September and found Willa at the kitchen table with her laptop and her records. He sat down across from her. He said, "Ray Peterson stopped me on the road today." She said, "What did he want?" He said, "He wanted to know about the ponds." She said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him to talk to you." He paused. "You were right," he said, "about all of it." She looked up from the laptop. He was looking at the table, not at her, in the way that men of his generation look at the table when they are saying something that costs them something. She said, "I know." He said, "I should have given you more ground in the beginning." She said, "You gave me what you could." He said, "Next spring, you decide the rotation. All of it." She closed the laptop. Let me tell you about what happened in November of 2022, because it is the part of the story that Willa did not plan for, but that everyone who heard about it later said they should have seen coming. Ned Crowley drove out to the Salazar farm on a Tuesday afternoon. He did not call ahead. Willa was at the east pond checking the aerator when she heard the truck on the gravel. She walked up to the yard and found him standing next to his pickup, looking at the ponds. He was wearing his co-op jacket. He had his hands in his pockets. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something on the drive over and was now trying to remember how it started. She said, "Ned." He said, "Willa." He looked at the ponds for another moment. Then he said, "I've got 3 farmers who want to know if you'd be willing to talk to them about setting up something like this." She looked at him. He said, "Peterson, the Dykstra brothers, and Harold Kowalski over on Route 15. She said, "I know who they are." He said, "They're serious. After this summer, they're serious." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You told me I was tying up corn acres to raise fish." He said, "I know what I said." She said, "You said it was an interesting experiment." He said, "I know." She said, "You said it was too early to draw conclusions." He looked at his boots. "Yeah," he said, "I know." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "The lesson isn't that paddlefish are better than corn. The lesson is that any farm that grows only one thing needs only one disaster to fail. That's what I told you in 2019. That's what the data said in 2019. The drought didn't teach that lesson. The data already had." He nodded. He said, "I know that now." She said, "Okay." She said it without heat, without satisfaction, without any of the things you might expect from someone who had been laughed at in public and had just been proven right in the worst possible way. She said it the way you say something when the argument is over, and what matters now is what comes next. She told him she would meet with Peterson, the Dykstra brothers, and Kowalski. She told him she would charge a consulting fee, because her time was worth something, and because she had spent 4 years building the knowledge she was being asked to share. He said that was fair. He said, "Thank you." He got back in his truck and drove down the gravel road. She watched him go. Then she went back to check the aerator. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in November of 2022, and what came after is as important as what came before. Ray Peterson put in one pond the following spring, 8 acres on his low ground, stocked with 3,500 paddlefish fingerlings from the same Missouri hatchery Willa used. The Dykstra brothers went in together on a larger system, 2 ponds totaling 18 acres, and hired Willa to consult on the design and the stocking plan. Harold Kowalski waited a year, watched the others, and then put in 2 ponds in 2024. By the spring of 2025, there were 11 paddlefish operations in Platte County, Nebraska, ranging from 8 to 30 acres of pond surface. Most of them had been designed with Willa's input. All of them were using the integrated effluent irrigation system she had developed. Paul Hennessy came back to Nebraska in the spring of 2024, when Willa's first fish, the ones from the Neosho Hatchery, now 5 years old, were approaching harvest maturity. The largest females were Carrie and Roe. She harvested 12 fish that first season, carefully, using a technique she had learned from a producer in Kentucky and refined over 2 years of preparation. The roe yield was 94 pounds across 12 fish. Hennessy placed it at $51 per ounce with buyers in Chicago and New York. The total revenue from that first roe harvest was $76,608 from 12 fish. She had 11,000 fish in the ponds. Ernesto sat at the kitchen table with the deposit confirmation on his phone and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Carmen brought him coffee. He said, 11,000 fish. Willa said, "Not all of them are females, probably 40%, and they won't all reach harvest maturity the same year." He said, "Still." She said, "Still." He said, "Your grandfather would have understood this. He used to say the ground gives back what you put into it." She said, "I know." You told me that when I was 8. He said, I should have listened to my own advice sooner. She smiled. She did not say anything else. The Nebraska Extension Service asked Willa to present at their annual conference in Lincoln in February of 2025. She drove down on a Thursday morning in her father's truck, wearing a Carhartt jacket and clean jeans, with a USB drive containing 6 years of data. Water quality logs, growth rate measurements, mortality records, soybean yield comparisons, revenue statements, soil nitrogen analysis from the integrated acres. She stood at a podium in front of 340 people, which was more people than she had ever spoken to, and she told the story of the back 40, the hatchery notice, the broker from Chicago, and the drought of 2022. She showed the numbers. She showed the per-acre revenue comparison between her pond acres and the county average for row crops across 6 years, in drought years and wet years. The comparison was not close. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping. Ernesto was in the 3rd row. He stood up when the clapping started. He was the first person standing. He stood there with his hands together and his jaw set, in the way that men of his generation hold themselves when they feel something they don't have words for. And he looked at his daughter at the podium, and he did not sit down until everyone else was standing too. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has one more turn, and it is the kind of turn that makes you understand why stories like this one are worth telling. In the fall of 2025, Willa's daughter, she had married a soil scientist from Kearney named Daniel Briggs in 2023, and their daughter, Rosalie, had been born that December, was obviously not yet old enough to propose anything. But Willa's younger brother, Marco, who was 19 and had been watching the pond since he was 13, came to the kitchen table one Sunday evening with a folder of his own. He sat down across from Willa and Ernesto and said, I want to talk to you about something that's going to sound strange. Willa looked at the folder. She recognized it. It was the same gesture, the same opening, the same weight on the table. Ernesto looked at her. She looked at Marco. She said, Okay, tell me. He opened the folder. It was full of research on constructed wetland systems. Shallow, planted impoundments that could be integrated with the existing pond infrastructure to create habitat for migratory waterfowl, generate carbon credits under the new federal program, and potentially support a fee hunting operation during migration season. The projected revenue per acre was not as dramatic as the Paddlefish numbers, but the capital cost was a fraction, and the timeline was measured in months, not years. He had done his homework. She could see that immediately. The citations were solid. The numbers were conservative. He had called the USDA office in Lincoln and spoken with someone about the carbon credit program. He had visited a constructed wetland operation in South Dakota the previous summer and taken photographs. He said, I know it sounds like a lot, but the low ground on the north section has never been right for row crops anyway. She looked at his folder. She looked at the photographs. She looked at the revenue projections. She thought about a Tuesday morning in November of 2018 when she had put her own folder on this same table and said almost exactly the same words. She said yes. She said it without hesitation, without qualifications, without telling him it was too early to draw conclusions or asking him how he would know if he was wrong. She said yes, the way someone says yes when they have learned, at some cost, that the person in the room most likely to see something new is the person who hasn't yet been told it can't be done. Ernesto looked at Marco's folder. He looked at Willa. He said, "How much ground?" Marco said, 60 acres to start. Ernesto said, "Okay," just like that. "Okay." The Salazar Farm in Platte County, Nebraska, runs 800 acres today. 40 acres of paddlefish ponds, now expanding toward 60. 11 farms in the county with similar systems. A consulting practice that Willa runs from the same kitchen table where she first opened her folder in 2018. A stand-in agreement with Paul Hennessy in Chicago. A USB drive with 6 years of data that she has shared with anyone who asked and some people who didn't. And a folder on Marco's side of the table, getting thicker every month. The hatchery in Neosho had 11,000 fish nobody wanted. The Caviar buyers found her first. And the 40 acres that Ned Crowley called corn ground is producing something that corn ground has never produced and will never produce, because the person who looked at it didn't see what everyone else saw. She saw water. She planted paddlefish in a corn county. They laughed. The drought came. The corn failed. The ponds held. The row sold. The county followed. And the folder on Marco's side of the table is getting thicker every month.